He said women don't belong here. Then learned. She founded the SEAL division he works for. The memo arrived on a Tuesday morning in March of 1987. 12 pages, typed on Naval Special Warfare Command letterhead, stamped confidential in red ink along the top margin. Commander Gerald Briggs set it on his desk without reading it. He already knew what it contained. He'd been told at the Friday briefing. The new division was approved. Operational by September, and the woman who designed it, written the doctrine, lobbied 5 admirals for 3 years to make it exist. She would be on site in Coronado by the end of the month. Briggs had been at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado for 9 years, had run the Advanced Maritime Operations course for 4. In that time, he had never once been told what to do by a woman who wore a uniform. He wasn't opposed to women in the Navy, he would tell people later. He just believed there were places that fit and places that didn't. He believed this the way some people believe in weather. It was simply true. It required no argument. He set the memo on the stack of papers beside his phone. Went back to the training schedule for the following week, didn't think about it again, until she walked into the building on April 3rd, 1987. Her name was Captain Diane Holloway. She was 44 years old. Had joined the Navy in 1965 at the age of 22, one of 26 women in the Naval Officer Candidate School class that year. She wore her hair short. Her uniform was pressed to the crease standard. She carried a canvas briefcase that looked like she'd owned it since the Johnson administration. She checked in at the front desk at 0800, signed the visitor log, asked the petty officer at the desk where Gerald Briggs's office was. He pointed down the hall. She walked the length of that hallway without pausing, without checking room numbers, as if she'd already committed the building layout to memory, which she had. She'd requested the architectural plans 2 months earlier, had gone over them on her kitchen table in Alexandria, Virginia, with a yellow highlighter and a cup of coffee that went cold before she finished. Briggs heard the knock. Said, "Come in." She came in. He did not stand. She introduced herself, extended her hand. He shook it, briefly, and gestured to the chair across from his desk. She sat, put the canvas briefcase across her knees, looked at him evenly. Said she wanted to talk through the integration timeline. He said they could do that. What happened next was not a confrontation, not an argument. She laid out the timeline in 17 minutes with a printed schedule she pulled from the briefcase. He asked 3 questions. She answered all 3 without hesitation and with specific numbers. He said he'd need to loop in his senior instructors before committing to anything. She said she understood and that she'd be available for a working session later in the week. She stood, shook his hand again, and left. It took Briggs approximately 40 minutes after she walked out to say what he said. He said it to Chief Petty Officer David Markham, who had worked with Briggs for 6 years and who was in the habit of stopping by the office mid-morning with 2 cups of coffee. Briggs took the coffee. Said he didn't think this was going to work. Said some things just don't fit. Said a woman designing the doctrine for a special operations division was one of those things. Markham nodded, drank his coffee, didn't say much. He knew better. Markham had spent the previous 2 weeks doing what Briggs apparently had not. He'd read the full project file, all 94 pages of it. He'd looked up Diane Holloway's service record, had found her assignments going back 22 years, starting with logistics analysis at Naval Station Norfolk in 1965, moving through intelligence coordination work in the Pacific Fleet, a deployment cycle with the 7th Fleet in 1971, a position at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, where she'd lectured on unconventional maritime doctrine starting in 1978. The division Briggs now commanded, the Maritime Special Operations Assessment Division, or MSOD, existed because of a proposal Holloway had written in 1983. 31 pages, single-spaced. She'd sent it to 3 admirals. 2 hadn't responded. The 3rd had forwarded it up the chain. Over the next 4 years, it had been revised 11 times, reviewed by 2 congressional subcommittees, and finally approved in December of 1986. Briggs had read none of this. He'd read the memo that arrived on his desk in March of 1987. The one about the integration timeline. The one he'd set aside without finishing. The working session happened on April 9th. Holloway brought 2 members of her planning staff, both lieutenant commanders, both of whom had served in fleet operations and who answered Briggs's questions with the same directness she did. The session ran 3 hours. Briggs came in with 7 objections. He left with 2, both of which were logistical, neither of which was fundamental. He still wasn't comfortable. He would say this later plainly. He wasn't comfortable with it. He didn't know how to explain why, exactly. He just knew that the division he'd been running for 4 years had a shape in his mind. And this was a different shape. He mentioned this to his wife, Carol, on a Wednesday evening in late April. She was making dinner. He was at the kitchen table with a beer he hadn't touched yet. She listened. She asked him one question. She asked him if Holloway knew what she was doing. He said he supposed she did. Carol went back to the stove. Didn't say anything else. The first joint training exercise ran in the 3rd week of May. Briggs had designed the exercise over 5 years of iteration, a 72-hour maritime infiltration scenario run off the coast, involving 8 candidates and a series of decision points that eliminated roughly half by the end of the first day. The failure rate was intentional. The whole point was pressure until fracture. Holloway had added one component to the exercise. A single 45-minute assessment window on the 2nd day, conducted at the 38-hour mark, when the candidates were sleep-deprived and cold, and had already been through 2 forced water entries in the dark. The window involved no physical task. It involved a decision brief. Candidates were pulled one at a time into a tent, given a scenario with incomplete intelligence and competing priorities, and asked to brief their recommended course of action in 8 minutes. Briggs had thought this was unnecessary. He'd said so in the April 9th meeting. Holloway had shown him the failure pattern data. 12 years of SEAL and Special Operations washout records, showing that 34% of candidates who passed physical selection failed in the first year of operational deployment, and that the failure mode most frequently cited in after-action reports was decision quality under stress with incomplete information. He had read the data, had not said anything else about the component. The first exercise ran May 18th through the 21st. 8 candidates in. 3 completed. That was standard. Briggs watched the decision brief assessment from outside the tent, standing in cold fog at 0300 on May 19th. He watched all 3 of the candidates who ultimately completed come through the tent with clean briefs. He watched 2 of the 5 who washed out freeze entirely in the brief, unable to construct a recommendation, even though physically they had been performing acceptably. He didn't say anything to Holloway about it that morning. He wrote it down in his field notes. Went back to the observation post. The second exercise ran in July. Same structure. Holloway had adjusted the decision brief based on debrief data from May, shortened the scenario setup, sharpened the decision demand. Briggs had looked at the revised protocol and said it seemed reasonable. He had not apologized for the April comment. Not yet. Through June and into July, the working relationship between Briggs and Holloway's planning team took on a different quality. Not warmth, exactly, competence recognition. He brought problems to the Tuesday coordination meetings. She brought solutions, or frameworks, or the names of people who had already solved similar problems. When she didn't know something, she said so directly, and then found out and reported back at the next meeting. The division was taking shape in a way that was different from the shape Briggs had imagined when he'd read the March memo. Smaller in some places, more precise in others. The doctrine Holloway had written wasn't the doctrine of someone guessing. It was the doctrine of someone who had spent 4 years looking at what special operations units failed at and building a structure designed around those failures. In September, the third exercise ran. 12 candidates this time. 4 completed. The decision brief assessment now ran 60 minutes instead of 45, and had been expanded to include a collaborative brief with a 3-person team element. After the exercise, at the debrief, Briggs made a comment about the team brief element. Said he thought it was the strongest component. Said it had surfaced something he hadn't seen in the individual assessment format. Holloway looked at him. Said she agreed. That was all. The moment Chief Petty Officer Markham had been waiting for came in October. Not because anything dramatic happened. Nothing dramatic happened. It came in the form of a question. They were at the Tuesday coordination meeting, the 6 of them around the table in the 3rd-floor conference room with the windows that looked out over the bay, and the subject was the next year's assessment calendar. Briggs had a draft on paper in front of him. He slid it across the table toward Holloway. He asked her what she thought. Not, here's the plan, does it work? Not, here are my decisions, do you have concerns? He asked her what she thought. Offered her the question the way you offer it to someone whose answer you're expecting to be useful. She picked up the paper. Read it for 3 minutes. Made 2 suggestions. He took both. Markham wrote nothing in his field notes that day. He just remembered it. The November exercise was the first one that ran under the full EMSO doctrine. 14 candidates. The integration of the physical selection track and the cognitive assessment track was complete. The exercise ran 96 hours, the longest to date, with 4 water insertions and a 22-mile land component through the mountains north of San Diego. 5 candidates completed. The completion rate wasn't what mattered. What mattered was the quality of the debrief data. For the first time in 4 years of running the course, Briggs had data that explained not just who completed, but why. The cognitive assessment had produced a profile for each candidate. The profiles correlated to performance patterns in the field. 3 of the 5 completers had been flagged by the decision brief assessment as high probability completes. 2 of the 9 washouts had been flagged as high risk at the 38-hour mark. He wrote this down. All of it. In the field notes that he had been keeping since April. 47 pages by November. In December, he asked Holloway if she'd read a paper from the Naval War College on cognitive load and operational decision-making. She said she'd read it when it came out in 1982. Said she'd used 3 of its findings in building the assessment framework. She said the citation was in the Doctrine Appendix, page 31. He had not read to page 31. He went back that evening and read it. Found the citation. Found the 4 other citations around it. Spent 2 hours with those papers at his kitchen table with a beer that went cold again. Carol came in around 9. Asked what he was reading. He told her. She looked at the stack of papers. Asked if he was still uncomfortable. He said no. Said he hadn't been for a while. The EMSOD completed its first full operational year in September of 1988. In that year, it had processed 61 candidates across 4 exercises. 22 had completed the full assessment. Of those 22, 19 were placed in special operations billets within the fleet. Of those 19, 17 were still in those billets at the 18-month follow-up, compared to a fleet baseline of 54% for comparable candidates selected through the previous process. 17 out of 19. 89% retention at 18 months. The fleet baseline was 54%. Holloway presented the data at a Naval Special Warfare Command review in February of 1989. 12 senior officers in the room. Briggs was one of them. He sat at the far end of the table, listened to her walk through 18 months of outcomes in 40 minutes, with the same directness she'd used when she'd walked into his office in April of 1987. At the end of the briefing, a Rear Admiral asked who had designed the cognitive assessment framework. Holloway said she had. Said it had come out of 12 years of looking at why trained people fail at the operational level. The Rear Admiral asked about the decision brief component specifically. Said it was the most interesting thing he'd seen in assessment methodology in 15 years. Briggs did not look down the table at Holloway when the Admiral said this. He looked at the briefing materials in front of him. He had his field notes there, the ones from the October meeting, the ones from November and December. He had been carrying them to every MSOD meeting for the past 8 months, which was a habit he developed without quite deciding to. He said something then. Said he agreed. Said the decision brief component had surfaced failure modes that the physical track alone couldn't see. The Admiral nodded, asked if the MSOD model could be replicated to other commands. Holloway said she thought it could. Said the doctrine was portable. Said the key was keeping the 2 tracks, physical and cognitive, integrated rather than sequential. The Admiral said he'd want a conversation about that. He got one. 3 conversations, in fact, over the spring of 1989. Briggs attended all 3. In the second one, the Admiral asked Briggs directly what he'd seen change in candidate quality since MSOD implementation. Briggs said the quality hadn't changed. Said the identification accuracy had changed. Said they were now selecting for what actually mattered rather than what was easiest to measure. He didn't look at Holloway when he said it. He didn't need to. The MSOD model was formally adopted by Naval Special Warfare Command in August of 1990. Holloway had retired from active duty 6 months earlier, in February at 47 years old, after 25 years of service. She'd gone quietly. No ceremony larger than a department gathering in a conference room in Coronado. She took the canvas briefcase, left the doctrine in the filing system where anyone could find it. Briggs was there, at the gathering. He shook her hand, said the course had improved. Said that was the word for it. She said she thought so too. That was it. He kept the field notes. 47 pages from the first year, another 32 from the second. He used them as the basis for a training manual he wrote in 1991 for new MSOD instructors. On the first page, before the table of contents, he wrote the name of the doctrine's author. Diane A. Holloway, Captain. Us, Rhett. Wrote the year of her original proposal. 1983. The manual went through 6 editions over the next 14 years. Briggs's name appeared on the cover of 4 of them, as lead author, and then as contributing author after he retired in 1997. Holloway's name appeared on every page 1. In 2003, a lieutenant commander named Paul Retz joined the MSOD staff at Coronado, fresh from a fleet deployment. He was 31, had come up through the standard pipeline, had heard of MSOD by reputation, but hadn't known its history. He found the training manual on his first day. Read the first page. Saw the name on the dedication. He didn't know who Diane Holloway was. He found out. called someone who'd been at Coronado in the late 80s, got the full story, sat with it for a day. Then he went back to the manual. Read the doctrine, all of it this time, starting at page 1, going through to the appendix. Page 31, where the citations were. The Naval War College paper on cognitive load and operational decision-making. The 4 papers around it. Retz ran the decision brief assessment for 11 years, used Holloway's original protocol with minor adaptations, trained 63 candidates through it, kept his own field notes, which he kept in a green binder on the shelf above his desk. The binder was still there when he transferred out in 2014. The doctrine is still in the filing system. Still used. Still accurate. The decision brief still runs at the 38-hour mark, when candidates are cold and tired, and the scenario has no clean answer. The canvas briefcase, Retz was told, went home to Alexandria and never came back to Coronado. It didn't need to.